My parents never loved me. In fact, they later sued me just to get money. And when the court ruled in my favor, my stepsister attacked me with a baseball bat. From the very beginning, it was clear I wasn't wanted. My parents didn't even bother to mask their indifference toward me. Even as a small child, too young to grasp the complexities of relationships, I could sense it, the coldness in their actions and the absence of warmth in their words. When I walked into a room, my mother's eyes would gloss over as if my presence was nothing more than an interruption. My father's responses were no better. Whether it was a picture I proudly drew, a curious question I asked, or simply just being around, his reactions were always detached, as if he couldn't be bothered. Looking back, I can't recall a single moment where I felt genuinely loved. Maybe they hadn't wanted children at all, but what I knew for sure was that they definitely hadn't wanted me. I still remember sitting at the dinner table when I was 5, watching them talk in low voices as though I didn't exist. My father, ever the workaholic, was a high-powered accountant, consumed with managing other people's money. My mother? She was lost in her own world, always busy shopping, gossiping, or immersing herself in meaningless hobbies. Neither of them had time for me. That neglect wasn't just occasional. It was a constant shadow over my childhood. When I started school, I naively thought it might be a turning point. Maybe if I excelled, brought home good grades, behaved impeccably, they'd notice me, maybe even be proud. But nothing changed. Whether I succeeded or struggled, it made no difference. My accomplishments were ignored, and my failures went unnoticed. School wasn't much better. I was the quiet kid who sat at the back of the room, blending into the walls. I didn't know how to make friends. How could I? Friendship was a foreign concept. My parents never modeled it, and I had no idea how to nurture it myself. Other kids had parents who came to their events, cheered at games, or attended parent-teacher conferences. My parents didn't even know such events existed, let alone care enough to show up. Over time, I learned to stop hoping, to stop expecting. I got good at pretending I didn't care, but deep down, the absence of their attention was a wound I carried every day. One memory sticks out vividly. I was 12, and our school held a talent show. Every other kid had their parents there, cheering them on and sharing proud hugs after the performance. My parents? They didn't even know it was happening. I didn't bother telling them because I knew they wouldn't come. Watching the other kids bask in their parents' love hurt more than I wanted to admit. I swallowed that pain, locked it away, and kept moving forward. That's what I always did. Move forward, even when all I wanted was to stop and scream for someone to notice me. By the time I was 15, I gave up completely. I stopped hoping, stopped trying. I accepted the fact that I was nothing more than an obligation to my parents, a burden they were stuck with. But I also made a promise to myself. I would leave. As soon as I could, I'd escape the cold, unloving house that suffocated me. School became my ticket out. If I could get into a good university, far away, I could start over. I threw myself into my studies, not because I loved learning, but because it was my lifeline. The day my acceptance letter arrived, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope. I got into a university far enough that my parents couldn't just drop by unannounced, not that they would have. For the first time, I saw a glimmer of possibility, a life where I could be free of their neglect and finally figure out who I was. The day I left for university, there were no hugs, no goodbyes, no advice. My mother barely looked up from her magazine, and my father stayed glued to a conference call. I walked out of that house without a backward glance, feeling nothing but relief. I had long since stopped expecting anything from my parents, and in return, I gave them nothing. Closing the door behind me that day, I felt an odd sense of liberation. I was finally free, or so I thought. Arriving at university was overwhelming. The campus seemed enormous, a maze of buildings filled with people who all appeared to know exactly where they were going and what they were doing. I felt tiny, lost in the sea of strangers. Yet there was a spark of excitement, too. For the first time, I had a chance to redefine myself. Nobody here knew who I was or the lonely life I had lived. I could become someone entirely new. But old habits are hard to break. I found myself slipping back into my familiar role, the quiet observer. At first, I barely talked to anyone. I sat in the back of lecture halls, completed my assignments, and kept to myself. It felt like I didn't belong, as though I were watching life from the outside while everyone else lived it fully. Others seemed so connected, so sure of themselves, while I was just me. Then, everything changed when I met them. It started with a group project in one of my classes. I assumed it would be just another awkward, forgettable experience. But these people were different. Jake was the first to break through my shell. Outgoing and effortlessly charismatic, he had a knack for making everyone feel at ease. His jokes were infectious, and his easygoing nature made him magnetic. For some reason, he decided I was worth engaging with. Then there was Lily, loud, unfiltered, and full of wild energy. She was unapologetically herself. She had this ability to walk into a room and fill it with her presence. Despite her larger-than-life personality, she was surprisingly kind. She didn't judge me for being quiet and never pushed me to talk more than I wanted to. Matt was almost the opposite of Lily, introverted, soft-spoken, and thoughtful. In many ways, he reminded me of myself. He was comfortable in the silence, never feeling the need to fill it with meaningless chatter. Sitting with him felt natural, as if we shared an unspoken understanding. And then there was Sophie. Sophie was different. She had a quiet intensity, a strength that drew me in. She wasn't the loudest or most outgoing, but when she spoke, her words carried weight. She had a way of looking at me, like she could see something in me I couldn't see in myself. She challenged me, not aggressively, but in a way that made me want to be better. By the end of the project, something had shifted. We weren't just group members anymore. We were something more. Friends? I wasn't sure, but I knew I wanted to spend more time with them. For the first time, I felt seen. Our bond deepened over late-night study sessions that turned into long conversations about life, our families, and our dreams. Slowly, I began to open up, sharing pieces of myself I had never shared with anyone. I told them about my parents, about the years of feeling invisible and unloved. To my surprise, they didn't pity me or judge me. They listened. They cared. For the first time in my life, I had people who genuinely cared about me. It was unfamiliar, but comforting. Over time, we became inseparable. We tackled classes together, studied side by side, and even attended parties. I wasn't much of a party person, but they always managed to drag me along. They were my people, my chosen family. For the first time, I felt like I belonged. One night, during one of our many late-night talks, Sophie proposed something radical. We were lounging in Jake's dorm room, passing around a cheap bottle of vodka and talking about what came next after graduation. "We should just leave," Sophie said suddenly. "Pack up and go. Start fresh, somewhere new." At first, we laughed. The idea seemed ridiculous. But the more we talked about it, the more it started to feel possible. None of us had strong ties holding us back. Jake's family was distant. Lily had always dreamed of leaving her hometown. Matt didn't say much, but it was clear he wasn't happy where he was. And me? I had nothing to lose. My parents barely acknowledged my existence. They wouldn't care if I vanished. So, we made a plan. We'd save money, graduate, and then leave everything behind. We didn't know exactly where we'd go, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that we'd be together and free. The day we left felt surreal. We packed all our belongings into 2 cars and drove away without looking back. We chose a city none of us had ever been to, a place far enough to feel like a new world, but not entirely alien. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. At first, life was everything we had hoped for. We found a cramped apartment that barely fit the 4 of us, but it didn't matter. We spent our days exploring the city, getting lost in its streets, and meeting new people. For the first time, we were free from our pasts, free to become whoever we wanted to be. But freedom came with a cost. The cracks began to show. Jake started disappearing for days without explanation, returning home looking exhausted and jittery. At first, we didn't press him for answers, but his deteriorating condition became impossible to ignore. Lily, always the life of the party, began hosting chaotic gatherings in our tiny apartment. At first, they were fun, music blaring, people laughing. But soon, the parties spiraled out of control. Strangers wandered in and out at all hours, leaving the apartment trashed. Lily shrugged it off, leaving the rest of us to clean up the mess. Matt retreated further into himself. Once quiet but present, he now locked himself in his room for days, barely speaking to any of us. As for Sophie, she tried to hold us together. She was the glue, the one who kept reminding us of why we had left in the first place. But even her strength was starting to crack. And I found myself caught in the middle, watching as the family I had chosen began to unravel before my eyes. When we asked Matt what was wrong, he would only mumble something about being tired. But it was clear to me that something heavier was weighing him down, something he wasn't ready or didn't know how to share. And then there was Sophie. Sophie, who had always been the rock for all of us, now carried a darkness in her eyes that unsettled me. She was restless, her strength overshadowed by something unspoken. She started staying out late, returning home in the early hours, sometimes with bruises she refused to explain. I should have pieced it all together, but I didn't. I was too busy clinging to the hope that things would somehow work themselves out. And then everything came crashing down. It was a Thursday night. Jake was nowhere to be found again, and the rest of us were scattered around the apartment, too drained from work and school to bother talking. The silence was thick, the kind of silence that screamed of unspoken fears. Then came a knock at the door. I opened it to find two men standing there. Their faces were stern, their eyes cold and unyielding. They asked for Jake. When I told them he wasn't home, they pushed past me without hesitation, barging in as though they owned the place. The next few moments were chaos. They tore through the apartment, flipping furniture, rifling through drawers, scattering our belongings everywhere. Lily screamed at them, demanding to know what they were doing, but they ignored her completely. Sophie tried to block one of them, standing her ground in front of a cabinet, but he shoved her aside like she was nothing. Matt stood frozen in the corner, pale and wide-eyed, too shocked to even move. One of the men finally turned to me, his voice low and sharp, the kind that sends chills down your spine. "Tell Jake he owes us. We'll be back." And just like that, they left, slamming the door behind them. We stood there, stunned and surrounded by the wreckage of what had been our home. None of us spoke for a long time. What could we say? We were shaken to the core, terrified of what might come next. It wasn't until hours later, when Jake finally returned, that the truth came out. Jake had gotten involved with the wrong people. Drugs, gambling, and a debt so large he had no way of paying it off. And now, because of his choices, we were all caught in the crossfire. That night changed everything. It wasn't just the physical mess they left behind. It was the sense of safety that had been shattered. We were angry, furious at Jake for dragging us into his mess, and even more furious at ourselves for not realizing the danger we were in sooner. For the next few days, the apartment was suffocatingly quiet. Jake was remorseful, but the tension between all of us was palpable. No one knew how to move forward from this. It was Sophie, as always, who took the lead. "We need a plan," she said firmly one evening, breaking the silence that had settled over us like a heavy fog. We were all sitting in the living room, pretending that life hadn't been completely upended, but her words hit hard. "If we don't figure this out, we're screwed." She was right. We couldn't keep living like this, drifting aimlessly while the threat of those men loomed over us. Her urgency snapped me out of my haze. We had to take control, not just of the immediate danger, but of our futures. The first thing we had to deal with was Jake. He was the source of the trouble, and it was clear we couldn't let things slide anymore. One night, we all sat him down in what felt more like an intervention than a conversation. Slowly, he spilled the whole story. He owed a massive debt to local dealers after gambling away money he didn't have. He had been drinking heavily and using drugs, convinced he could handle it all. But like always, it had spiraled out of control. Jake was a wreck. The shame on his face was unmistakable. As angry as we were, we couldn't abandon him. For better or worse, he was family. And family doesn't walk away, even when things are hard. Together, we pooled what little money we had and managed to pay off the debt. It left us practically broke, but it gave Jake a second chance. From that moment on, he changed. He quit drinking, cut ties with his toxic friends, and started rebuilding himself from the ground up. It wasn't easy. There were nights when he nearly slipped, but we stuck by him. Slowly, he started to heal. But Jake wasn't the only one fighting demons. Lily had always been the wild one, but after the incident, her recklessness grew even more alarming. She threw herself into partying harder than ever before, coming home at odd hours, sometimes drunk, sometimes not, but always with a haunted look in her eyes. It took me a while to realize she was running from something, using the chaos to mask her pain. One night, Sophie pulled her aside after yet another out-of-control party. Sophie didn't sugarcoat it. "You're not okay, Lily. You need help." At first, Lily resisted, her anger flaring up at the mere suggestion. But Sophie held her ground, refusing to let her off the hook. Eventually, Lily broke down, admitting through tears that she had been battling crippling anxiety for years. The partying, the drinking, the drugs, they were all ways to quiet the constant storm in her head. It was a lot to take in, but we rallied around her. Just like with Jake, we made sure she didn't face it alone. We were far from perfect, and the scars from everything we'd been through ran deep. But for the first time in a long time, we weren't running anymore. We were fighting together. When we sat down in Richard Finn's office, the tension in the room was palpable. His team was polished and professional, the kind of people who exuded confidence and control. Meanwhile, we were just four scrappy 20-somethings who had been running our operation out of a cramped apartment. It felt like David meeting Goliath, and we weren't sure if Goliath came in peace or to crush us once and for all. Richard greeted us with a firm handshake and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've been hearing a lot about the Phoenix Fund," he began, his voice smooth and measured. "You've made quite an impact in a short amount of time." We exchanged wary glances. Was this a compliment or the prelude to a polite takedown? "Thanks," Sophie said cautiously. "We've been working hard to help people." Richard nodded, leaning back in his chair. "And you've done a remarkable job, considering your limited resources. But I imagine it hasn't been easy. Running a nonprofit, especially one focused on at-risk populations, is challenging." Jake couldn't hold back a scoff. "That's putting it mildly." Richard's smile widened slightly. "Exactly. Which is why I wanted to meet with you. We've been in this game for a long time, and we know how tough it can be. I think there's an opportunity here for us to work together." That caught us off guard. "Work together?" I repeated, not entirely convinced. "You've been undercutting us for months. Why the sudden change of heart?" Richard didn't flinch. "Fair question. The truth is, we initially saw you as competition. But the more we looked into what you're doing, the more we realized that our missions align. We're both here to help people who have been overlooked, people who need a second chance. Instead of working against each other, we could combine our efforts and do even more good." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "And what would that look like? Us working under you?" Richard chuckled, as if the idea amused him. "Not at all. I'm proposing a partnership. Lifeline Ventures has the resources, the infrastructure, and the connections. The Phoenix Fund has the heart, the grassroots energy, and a fresh perspective. Together, we could create something truly transformative." It sounded too good to be true. And maybe it was. We peppered him with questions, trying to figure out what the catch was. Would we lose control of the fund? Would we have to answer to Lifeline Ventures for every decision? Richard assured us that we'd maintain our autonomy, that this was about collaboration, not absorption. Still, the idea made us uneasy. After everything we had fought for, could we trust a big organization like Lifeline Ventures not to steamroll us? On the other hand, we were barely scraping by, and their support could take us to the next level. We asked for time to think it over, and Richard agreed, giving us a week to decide. As we walked out of that fancy office and back into the real world, the weight of the decision hung heavy over us. Back at the apartment, we debated endlessly. Jake was all for the partnership. "We need the money, and they have it," he argued. "We can't keep running on fumes forever." Lily was skeptical. "Yeah, but what's the price? What happens if they start calling the shots? We've worked too hard to let someone else take control." Matt, as usual, was the voice of calm reason. "We don't have to rush this. Let's look into Lifeline Ventures more closely. If they've got a history of steamrolling smaller organizations, we'll walk away. But if they're legit, this could be our shot at something big." Sophie was the hardest to read. She listened to all of us, her expression unreadable before finally speaking. "We need to be smart about this. If we do this, it has to be on our terms. No compromises that go against what we stand for." For the next few days, we dug into Lifeline Ventures' history, their partnerships, their impact. To our surprise, their track record was clean. They had genuinely helped countless people and had even collaborated with smaller organizations in ways that allowed them to thrive. It seemed, at least on the surface, that Richard's offer was genuine. When the week was up, we met with Richard again. This time, we came prepared with a list of conditions. We would maintain control over the Phoenix Fund's operations. We would have an equal say in all joint decisions, and we wouldn't compromise our mission or values for the sake of expansion. To our surprise, Richard agreed to everything without hesitation. "You've got yourselves a deal," he said, extending his hand. And just like that, the Phoenix Fund entered a new chapter. The partnership with Lifeline Ventures changed everything. With their resources, we were able to expand our reach, helping more people than we ever thought possible. We moved into a proper office, hired a small team, and launched initiatives that went far beyond what we had imagined in those early days. But we never lost sight of where we came from. Every decision we made was rooted in the lessons we had learned during our toughest times. We knew what it felt like to hit rock bottom, and that empathy guided everything we did. As the years went on, the Phoenix Fund became a beacon of hope for thousands of people. And though we faced challenges along the way, we faced them together. Jake, Lily, Matt, Sophie, and I, each of us had risen from the ashes, and together we helped others do the same. In the end, the Phoenix Fund wasn't just about giving people a second chance. It was about proving that no matter how broken you feel, no matter how impossible things seem, you can rebuild. You can rise. My father's jaw clenched so hard I thought he might crack a tooth. My mother's face, already tight with judgment, twisted into something uglier, disdain mixed with fury. "Ungrateful," she hissed, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through steel. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us?" I stood up, leaning over my desk, my voice steady but brimming with years of pent-up anger. "What exactly did you do for me? Ignore me? Treated me like a mistake? You didn't raise me. You tolerated me. And now, you think you're entitled to something I've worked my entire life for? Forget it." My father took a step closer, his tone shifting to one of forced calm, though his eyes burned with anger. "You wouldn't have had the education or the opportunities to get where you are without us. We invested in you, and now it's time for you to honor that investment." I scoffed, shaking my head in disbelief. "Invested in me? You didn't even say goodbye when I left for university. You didn't care where I went, what I did, or how I survived. You didn't invest in me. You abandoned me. I owe you nothing." The room went silent for a moment, the tension thick enough to choke on. My mother broke it, her voice dripping with condescension. "You're making a big mistake, Liam. A family is supposed to stick together, and you're pushing us away. This fund wouldn't even exist if we hadn't provided for you all those years." I laughed bitterly. "Family? You mean the family that made me feel like I didn't belong? The family that never showed up? Never cared? No thanks. I've already got a real family, my friends, my team, the people who've actually been there for me." My father's calm facade cracked. "You'll regret this. Mark my words, Liam. When the world turns its back on you, don't come crawling to us." "Don't worry," I shot back. "I haven't needed you before, and I sure as hell won't need you in the future." Without another word, they turned and stormed out, my father slamming the door behind him. I stood there, breathing hard, the echoes of their footsteps fading down the hallway. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of sadness, a lingering shadow of the child who had once desperately wanted their approval. But it was gone as quickly as it came. That night, I gathered my team, Sophie, Jake, Lily, and Matt. I needed to tell them what had happened, but more importantly, I needed to remind myself why we started this journey in the first place. As we sat in the cozy conference room of our now bustling office, I recounted the encounter. Sophie listened intently, her eyes narrowing at all the right moments. Jake muttered a few choice words under his breath, clearly angrier than I was. Lily shook her head in disbelief, while Matt, as usual, quietly absorbed everything. They don't get to take this from you, Sophie said firmly when I finished. The Phoenix Fund isn't just about you. It's about all of us, about what we've built together. Jake chimed in, and there's no way we're letting anyone, family or not, tear it down. Their words bolstered me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. Thanks, guys, I said, feeling a weight lift off my chest. I just needed to get it off my chest. We've come too far to let anything or anyone drag us back. In the weeks that followed, I received a letter from my parents' lawyer. They were suing me. Their claim? That I had used family resources to start the Phoenix Fund and that they were entitled to a share of it. It was absurd, but it wasn't unexpected. When I showed the letter to Carl, our lawyer, he let out a dry laugh. They really think this is going to work? Don't worry, Liam. They don't have a case. We'll take care of it. The legal battle that followed was grueling. My parents threw everything they could at me, dragging out the process and trying to paint me as an ungrateful, selfish son who had turned his back on his family. It was exhausting, but I refused to back down. Through it all, my team stood by me. They reminded me every day why I was fighting, why the Phoenix Fund mattered, not just to me, but to the people we were helping. And in the end, the court sided with us. My parents' case was dismissed, and they were ordered to pay all legal fees. It was a victory, but it didn't feel like one. It felt like the final nail in the coffin of a relationship that had been broken from the start. But it also felt like freedom. I was finally free from their control, their manipulation, their toxicity. Today, the Phoenix Fund is stronger than ever. We've expanded our reach, helping thousands of people rise from their own ashes. And though the scars of my past remain, they no longer define me. Sometimes I think about my parents, about the life I might have had if they had loved me the way parents are supposed to love their child. But then I look at what I've built, at the family I've chosen, and I know I wouldn't change a thing. Because in the end, I didn't just survive their neglect. I thrived in spite of it. And that, to me, is the greatest victory of all. The room was tense, the silence heavy after my parents stormed out. I had always known they were capable of coldness, but their audacity to sue me for something I built with no help from them was beyond my imagination. Yet, when the lawsuit arrived, my disbelief turned into anger. They were actually doing it, trying to stake a claim in the Phoenix Fund, claiming it was all because of their so-called support. My lawyer, Amelia, was confident. "This is ridiculous," she told me. "They don't have a shred of evidence. They're banking on you caving under pressure." But I wasn't about to fold. The trial was a nightmare. My parents painted me as an ungrateful child, accusing me of abandoning the very people who had sacrificed everything for me. The lies they told in court twisted the truth so badly that it made my stomach churn. I wanted to scream that they had never sacrificed anything, that they had abandoned me long before I ever left home. But Amelia stayed composed, countering their baseless claims with facts and logic. Then things took a bizarre turn. Their lawyer, Gregory Whitman, was an utter disaster, disorganized, erratic, and overly dramatic. He constantly contradicted himself, and Amelia suspected there was more to his behavior than mere incompetence. She was right. 3 months into the trial, it was revealed that Gregory wasn't even a licensed attorney. He had falsified his credentials and been practicing law illegally for years. The court erupted in chaos, and the judge dismissed the case immediately. My parents' humiliation was complete. Not only had they lost the case, but they had also become a public spectacle. I thought that was the end of it, but I underestimated their ability to cause chaos, even in defeat. 3 months later, I was walking home late one evening after a long day at the office. The streets were quiet, and the cool night air was refreshing. I decided to take a shortcut through an alley, something I'd done countless times before. Halfway through, I noticed a figure standing at the other end. As I got closer, I realized it was a woman, a tall, muscular woman holding something in her hand. Astilba. She stepped into the dim light, and her face was contorted with rage. Her eyes locked onto mine with a hatred so intense, it froze me in my tracks. "You're him," she spat, her voice venomous. "You're the reason my life was ruined." I didn't even have time to process what she meant before she swung the bat. I barely dodged it, the metal whistling past my head. "Wait!" I shouted, backing away, my heart pounding. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Shut up!" she screamed, swinging again and catching me in the ribs. Pain exploded through my side, and I stumbled, gasping for breath. She kept advancing, her words sharp and furious. "Because of you, they lost everything. Because of you, they're gone." I was terrified and confused, but as she ranted, it began to make sense. "My parents," I managed to say, clutching my side. "You're talking about my parents?" "Yes," she shouted, her face twisted with fury. "Your precious parents. They adopted me, treated me like garbage, and lost everything because of you. Now they're gone, and it's all your fault." The realization hit me like another blow from her bat. I had a half-sister, someone my parents had adopted after I left for university. They had never told me. Apparently, their neglect hadn't stopped with me. Before I could say anything else, she raised the bat again. This time, I couldn't move fast enough. The bat struck my shoulder, and I crumpled to the ground, the pain blinding. She loomed over me, her weapon poised for the final blow. But then a voice rang out. "Hey, stop!" Two passersby had seen what was happening and rushed into the alley. One tackled her to the ground, while the other called the police. I lay there, barely conscious, as the world blurred around me. I woke up in a hospital bed, my body aching from multiple fractures and internal injuries. The doctors told me I was lucky to be alive. My attacker, my half-sister Rebecca, was arrested and charged with attempted murder. During her trial, the full story came to light. My parents had adopted her as a last-ditch effort to have the perfect child they thought I never was. But just as they had done with me, they neglected her, subjecting her to the same indifference and criticism. When they lost the lawsuit and became a public embarrassment, their lives fell apart, and they lost custody of Rebecca. That's when she snapped, blaming me for everything. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Witnesses, security footage, and the weapon itself. She was convicted and sentenced to several years in prison. Throughout the trial, she showed no remorse, glaring at me with pure hatred every time I entered the courtroom. After the trial, I couldn't stop thinking about Rebecca and my parents. They had caused so much pain, to me, to her, to themselves. They were incapable of love, of kindness, of anything but bitterness and control. And while I felt a sliver of pity for Rebecca, I knew I couldn't let their ghosts haunt me any longer. I poured myself back into the Phoenix Fund, focusing on the people who mattered, the team I had built, the lives we were changing. My past was a weight I could never fully escape, but it no longer defined me. I had survived their neglect, their lawsuits, and even their violence. I had risen from the ashes, stronger and more determined than ever. And no one, not my parents, not Rebecca, not anyone, could take that away from me.